This man right here is Bruce Jeffrey Padro. Bruce lived in the San Fernando Valley area of California. On the surface, at least, he was doing really well in life. He was a graduate of California State University, and he had a pretty good job at ITT Electrical Systems, with radar systems. In 2004, Bruce met a woman that he fell for, hard. Her name was Sylvia Orza. They dated for a while and soon got married in January of 2006. However, the marriage began to sour pretty quickly and they started growing apart. Sylvia wasn't too happy with how Bruce was acting in their marriage. For example, Bruce refused to open a joint bank account with her and expected her to use her own finances to pay for pretty much everything to do with all 3 of her kids. Eventually, pretty quickly, in June of 2008, it was decided that there would be a divorce. The divorce ended up going pretty heavily in Sylvia's favor. The courts ordered Bruce to pay $1,785 a month to Sylvia in spousal support. Bruce was very unhappy with the way things were turning out, telling a friend that his wife was taking him to the cleaners. Just 1 month later in July, Bruce got fired from his job. It was found that he was billing clients for hours that he hadn't actually been working. Due to this, the courts did at least suspend his support payments for the time being. As part of the divorce settlement, Bruce was also required to pay Sylvia a flat sum of $10,000. Sylvia kept the wedding rings and she kept their dog. Bruce complained to the courts that Sylvia wasn't going through any sort of hardship. She was living with her parents, rent-free, bought a new luxury car, regularly went on gambling trips to Vegas, ate out at nice restaurants, and frequently received massages and attended golf courses. Do keep in mind that, on the contrary, Sylvia's friends assert that this was not the case at all. It came to be known that one big deciding factor in this divorce was the fact that Bruce had been concealing a child from a previous marriage. That child had been severely injured in a swimming pool accident years prior and likely required constant medical care. Not only did he not support this child at all, he completely cut off his ex-wife and her children. Bruce may have been a tad bit shady, especially when being fired from his job for fraudulent billing, and his whole bailing on his previous marriage and child, but he had no criminal record whatsoever. He had no history of violence either. However, this divorce absolutely shattered Bruce. It changed him. His vendetta with Sylvia became all he could think about. He didn't only want to get rid of her, he wanted to get rid of her entire world. He wanted to end everything she loved and cared about. Then came the fatal night of December 24th, 2008, Christmas Eve. The Ortega family, Sylvia's extended family, invited their whole family over to their home in Covina, California. Covina was actually known as being a nicer area outside of LA with a much lower crime rate, a good place for family. The Ortega family loved Christmas. It was their favorite time of year to gather up the family, mainly their 2 older sons, James and Charles, and their daughters, Letitia, Alicia, and Sylvia. On Christmas Eve, the older members of the family were playing a lively game of poker in the front room. The energy was good, and everyone was having a good time. Some of the younger members of the family were hanging out in the back of the house, some were out back by the pool, and a few were playing video games on a PC upstairs. Altogether, there were about 25 people at the house. The doorbell rang. The family, assuming it was one more guest to join the festivities, allowed 8-year-old Katrina, the daughter of Letitia, to go open the door. She happily ran toward the door to greet the next guest. But what actually came next was absolutely not what anyone could have anticipated. At around 11:30 p.m., the door opened to reveal Bruce Padro, dressed in a complete Santa suit, carrying a huge gift-wrapped package, which, inside, contained all of the elements of his revenge. Katrina happily yelled out, "Santa Claus, Santa Claus," when Bruce reached into his package to pull out a 9mm handgun. He immediately shot her in the face. The bullet struck the side of her jaw, likely because she quickly turned her head at the last second. She collapsed to the ground. The shots continued, and 2 of her uncles also fell to the ground, wounded. The family members who were playing poker, including Sylvia, hid under the kitchen table, but it didn't provide much cover at all. Bruce was firing indiscriminately. He didn't really have a specific target. He wanted to eliminate everything, everyone. Sylvia, her whole family, all of her friends, everyone. He stood over and executed several of the victims. The adults, being at the front of the home, were much more vulnerable in the attack as they were immediately visible and had no time to run or hide. "It's Bruce," yelled one person at the party, recognizing him. The family was fully aware of who was attacking them as they died, one by one. Several of the wounded family members tried to get up and grab Bruce, despite being gravely injured. However, despite all the struggling, they just simply didn't have the strength to take him down. Katrina, despite being shot in the face, stood up and staggered out of the house. Seeing this, her mother Letitia made a break for it and sprinted out of the house as well, shocked that her daughter was even alive at all. Some of the other adults were able to grab some of the children and carry them out of the home. Virtually all of the younger people were safe as they were in the back of the house and weren't immediately seen when Bruce opened fire. Satisfied that he had shot enough of them, Bruce stopped to open the rest of his gift wrap package. From it, he pulled out a compressor and used it to spray gasoline all over the house and catch it on fire. However, Bruce made a huge mistake. He didn't realize that there was already an open flame somewhere in the house, possibly a candle or a stovetop. It led to a massive explosion that he wasn't ready for. Bruce had also brought a device he made himself that was capable of quickly engulfing the entire house in flames. He and this device were caught in the explosion, leaving him horrifically burned. Unfortunately, this explosion also resulted in the only death of a minor throughout the incident as well. Michael Ortiz, who was playing on the computer upstairs, ended up passing away. His mother didn't make it out either. Bruce then took off his Santa costume, changed back into his street clothes, and got into his car. He escaped. 9 people died in the attack, either from gunfire or flames or a combination of both. Sylvia had died early on in the mayhem. Her mother, father, 2 brothers, and her sister died as well, along with 3 other family members. 3 others were wounded. Katrina survived her gunshot to the face. The injury was severe, but ultimately not life-threatening. A 16-year-old girl was merely wounded by a shot to the back, and a 20-year-old woman injured her ankle by jumping from a second-story window to escape. Several people escaped from the home, and many of them made calls to the police as quickly as they could. One survivor even called during the attack itself. Shortly after, the home erupted into 50-foot-tall flames, engulfing the entire house and clearly visible from all throughout the neighborhood and even more. Neighbors from all over were calling in to the police, including one who had the insight to see that the fire was deliberately set, likely having heard the gunshots before. "Come immediately, they're burning down someone's house," she said. The scene was absolute chaos. The fire took firefighters over an hour and a half to extinguish. By this time, the only way to identify the victims was from dental and medical records. Now, Bruce may have escaped the scene, but he didn't get away with it. It seems in hindsight that Bruce had planned to escape after the incident, but this was severely hindered by the brand new 3rd-degree burns covering his arms. He had planned to get into his car and drive off to kill Sylvia's attorney next, but it's likely that he was in such extreme pain that even operating the steering wheel was an excruciating task. Much of his Santa costume had actually melted and adhered to his skin, becoming impossible to remove and causing him immense pain. After killing the attorney, he had planned to fly out to Illinois. He had recently told a high school friend that he was planning to visit. It's debated on whether or not this trip was a ruse to fool investigators. It's speculated that he had actually planned to flee to Mexico, which would have made much more sense, and that buying this ticket to Illinois was mainly to throw them off long enough for him to do so. However, in his extreme pain, it seems that he no longer felt that he was up to escaping. He drove 40 miles to his brother's house. His brother was not home. He then entered the home, put the gun in his mouth, and ended his life. Amidst the chaos, police were called out to the home of Bruce's brother. He had returned home from a Christmas party to find his brother dead on the ground. When they arrived, police found a single shot from a 9mm handgun in his head, a hole in the ceiling above, a handgun in his lap, and another on the floor next to him. The situation seemed obvious, but at the moment they couldn't ignore the possibility of a second shooter that had turned on Bruce. One day later on Christmas, police interviewed Letitia, who was immediately able to identify the shooter, her sister's ex-husband, Bruce Padro. Hearing this, police went back to Bruce's brother's home to search his car, which was a car that was reported by neighbors to have been at the scene of the murders. Inside, they found the charred remains of a Santa suit. There was also a computer, clothes, water, food, and maps of both the US and Mexico. They then searched the brothers' home once again. They found $17,000 shrink wrap to one of Bruce's legs. They also found 4 13-round capacity handguns that were completely emptied out, but also found about 200 rounds of extra ammunition lying around. Due to some of the gear seen in the car, it was thought that calling the bomb squad in might be the best thing to do before proceeding. While they were investigating, a portion of the Santa suit actually caught on fire once again, starting a blaze that soon engulfed the whole car, destroying it. A homemade bomb had been left in the car, under the suit. Searching Bruce's own home, they found 5 empty handgun boxes, a tactical shotgun, and a container for gasoline. They said his home was a virtual bomb factory. They dropped their assumption that a second killer was involved. It was growing ever more clear that Bruce had done this, and that he was already long gone. 3 of the victims had died purely from gunshot wounds. 4 more died of a combination of gunshot wounds and fire. 2 more deaths were purely from the fire alone. 13 children were left as orphans after the incident, with several more losing one parent. Police, and many others, assumed that the motive behind the attack was Bruce's nasty divorce. It's also widely believed that he didn't originally intend to end his own life, and he simply did so because he felt no choice after the terrible injuries he suffered. He left no notes, no video, no recording, nothing to explain any of this any further. He wanted to kill everyone, even his own mom. A monster, a monster. That man was a monster. He killed good, hard-working people who had many friends and who loved the United States, said Chapta Ortega, one of the survivors. The home was demolished and remained an empty lot, a grim reminder of what once occurred there for many years, up until a new home was built there in 2018, 10 years after the attack. Seeing the neighborhood now, you'd never know anything was amiss. Aziz Yazdanpana was a 56-year-old Iranian-born father of 2 living in the United States with his family, more specifically in Colleyville, Texas, near the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. He was lovingly referred to by his neighbors as Bob, for some reason, and was said to be seen mostly out working in his yard, seeming carefree with no signs of conflict. In 2008, he had been unemployed for over a decade. He had previously been working in the mortgage business, but for some unknown reason he had quit and refused to ever go back to working in his field. This really hit him in the pride and became a sore spot for him, a real hot-button issue. It didn't help that his wife, Fatima Ramadi, was working, and his wife's brother, Ali Ramadi, had been financially supporting the family for years. Initially, Fatima utilized her cosmetology license and had 2 jobs at 2 different spas. But in the end, she was running a beauty salon in the nearby city of Plano. Formerly, Aziz had forbidden his wife from working, but after he stopped working himself, he relented and decided it would be better that she work than that nobody work. But she did still struggle to support the family on her own without Aziz working alongside her. They went into financial troubles only a few years after he stopped working. But even before, Aziz hadn't really been the best with finances himself. Federal court records show that he was actually placed on 3 years of probation back in 1996, after it was discovered that he was caught falsifying a federal income tax return. He ended up having to pay a $1,000 fine and $30,119 in restitutions. Then, 3 years later, he and his wife filed for bankruptcy. Fatima had hoped that the proceedings would keep the banks from foreclosing on their home for, if nothing, a little bit longer, but the case was discharged within a few months after they failed to make planned payments. Throughout this time, Aziz wasn't exactly being a model father. According to friends, he would often lie about trips that he took to his wife, saying that he was going on business trips or something, but actually going to a hotel and sleeping with prostitutes. Can I say prostitutes? I mean, I got away with it in the K-pop video, but... Eventually, one of these friends would go on to tell Ramadi about these escapades, obviously leading to tensions in the marriage. Ultimately, 1 year later in 2011, Aziz's wife, Fatima, decided to move out of their family home in April and take the family's 2 children with her. They moved into an apartment complex only 2 miles away, but even this much distance was enough to drive Aziz wild. Not only did he have the shame and guilt of being unemployed while his wife and his brother-in-law covered the finances, but he now had his kids taken away from him as well. Fatima was generally a private person who nearly really ever spoke out about her personal life with her co-workers, but it was clear even to them that she was overworked, stressing out, and struggling to support her family. A co-worker told police that she did have several conversations with her, in which she stated her complaints that Aziz was neither providing for his family nor living up to his Muslim responsibility. Ramadi was concerned that Aziz was not taking the income divorce proceedings very well at all. She had voiced this concern to both some of her colleagues and to her apartment management. At least one of Aziz's neighbors referred to him, instead of just Bob, as Packing Heat Bob. It seems that once in the past, Aziz had told his neighbor that he was carrying a gun because he was having problems with the boys trying to date his daughter. The neighbor was seemingly unsure if he was actually serious, mistakenly taking the matter as a joke. Aziz's daughter, Nona, had recently graduated from Colleyville Heritage High School and was starting to attend a local community college. She had hoped to go on to a school in California and become a lawyer. Her friend had indicated that she had recently hinted that things in her life were becoming increasingly difficult, but she didn't give many details. Her father had become extremely strict with her, likely over fears that she may begin dating someday, and she came to see her mother as the more rational and understanding parent. People saw Aziz as a bum and maybe even a little bit of an asshole, but nobody really assumed that he would get violent. On Christmas Eve, the Yazdanpah family was throwing a huge party at their ranch. A whole slew of family and friends came and went out to the house throughout the evening, dragging long into the night. Aziz hated his wife's sister with a passion. He felt that she did nothing but serve as an obstacle in his marriage, and felt that she was often trying to drive a wedge between he and his wife. He felt that she had control over the kids as well, and was fully convinced that she was telling the kids that he was evil, and that they were listening. She had helped Ramadi move into her new apartment, and even helped her buy some necessities like furniture, consumables, and Aziz likely saw this as something that reaffirmed his previous beliefs. He was deeply insulted when his wife and the rest of the family didn't invite him out to the Christmas party. He was even more angry when he learned that his sister-in-law was in attendance. He seethed in anger all throughout the night and into the next morning. The next morning, Christmas morning, Fatima, the kids, and some other family members were at the apartment she was staying at in Grapevine. Aziz decided to show up, unexpectedly and unannounced, also uninvited, dressed as Santa Claus. The family begrudgingly let him in. Many of them did not do much to hide their disgust. His niece, Sarah, sent a text message to her friend shortly after Aziz arrived. "So, we're here. We just got here and my uncle is here too, dressed as Santa. Awesome." Her sarcasm was a secret to nobody. Aziz was clearly unwelcome at the home, but nobody wanted to be the one to kick him out. About 15 minutes later, she again texted, now he wants to be all fatherly and win Father of the Year because he fucked up before. This would be the last time that anybody would hear from her. The whole family opened presents and talked for a while, with Aziz awkwardly trying to act like the best father he could imagine. To his dismay, nobody was about to be fooled. Perhaps this was all some wicked test that Aziz had planned out to see if his wife and kids would respect him if he showed up. Or maybe he had already decided on his next move and he was merely biding his time and waiting for an opportunity. When the family finished opening up presents and started cleaning up the wrapping paper, Aziz revealed 2 handguns. It is unknown exactly how and in what order the following events played out, but this is what is known. Aziz aimed his guns and shot his wife, Fatima, once in the head. He shot his 14-year-old son, Ali, and 19-year-old daughter, Nona, each multiple times in the head. He shot both his sister-in-law and her husband, and went as far as killing their daughter, the niece that had sent the text messages, as well. At 11:34 a.m., Aziz then called 911 himself. During this call, the dispatcher was unable to hear him clearly. Hearing nothing but gasping breaths, the operator asked if he needs any help or if he was sick, but the responses were incomprehensible. Officers, believing nobody was on the other end of the call, decided to go ahead and head over to the location. Trying one more time, the operator asked if he needed an ambulance or police. Let's listen to the call and see if you can make out what he's trying to say here.
Grapevine 911, where is your emergency? Hello, Grapevine 911. You need help? Are you sick? What was that? Do you need an ambulance or police? Hello? One moment. I was getting heavy breathing on the phone and I was trying to talk to you, so please send both.
The original audio was almost impossible to make out, and it wasn't able to be understood until the dispatchers used software to amplify his voice. Even then, it took them several playbacks until they understood. Aziz had whispered, "I'm shooting people," into the phone. In the background, it's believed that someone was screaming, "Help, help." After making the 911 call, Aziz gave up the fight. He tried to stage a scene by placing one of the 2 guns into the hand of his dead brother-in-law, trying to make it look as if he committed the crime. But he took the other gun, turned it on himself, and took his own life before the police arrived. Police arrived just 3 minutes later and forced themselves into the home via kicking down the door. They entered the middle-class suburban apartment in hopes of finding out that this was all a misunderstanding. Sadly, that was not the case, and they were too late. They found that nobody in the home was still alive. They retreated to a horrific scene that Christmas Day. 7 bodies were sprawled out among the freshly opened presents and shredded wrapping paper. Some of the victims were still in their pajamas. A TV was still playing in the living room. Everyone had been shot at least once in the head, including Aziz himself, with several covered in bullet holes over the rest of their bodies as well. In this area, many of the nearby apartments were actually vacant, leaving no adjacent neighbors to report any odd sounds. The nearest people who lived nearby had actually described the day as quiet. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 59, spanned several generations, and consisted of 2 families. 2 entire nuclear families had been wiped out in the span of a few minutes. The police were not thrown off by the scene that Aziz had staged. It was pretty blatantly obvious that the brother-in-law had not fired a gun and that Aziz had been the only one to fire off both of the handguns found in the house. With the completion of an initial brief examination, it was my opinion that the victims had been systematically executed, said one investigator. All of the evidence would lead one to believe that Yazdan Panah had been the lone shooter during the incident, wrote another. Neighbors were shocked to look outside and see the investigation happening from their windows. There hasn't been any crime in this complex that they know of, not even a break-in, said nearby resident Vanessa Barrera. To hear something like this, it's shocking. Police, not knowing the family history, struggled to find a motive. I think he was probably overwhelmed when it was all said and done and decided to take his life instead, said Police Sergeant Robert Everling. We really don't have any clear idea of why he did this. Sometimes there's not really a good explanation for irrational behavior. A private burial was held for the family the next Thursday, during which a family friend stated that she had felt that Aziz had become upset because his wife was doing well on her own. However, despite knowing of these marital issues, friends of the family never even began to imagine something like this would ever happen. The mayor of the city, William Tate, even spoke out that Sunday night in a statement saying, "This is obviously a terrible tragedy. The fact that it happened on Christmas makes it even more tragic." A candlelight memorial service was held in Parr Park in Grapevine later in the year to honor the victims of the massacre. The city is normally a very quiet area, with the last homicide having occurred more than a whole year prior. One of the neighbors in the apartment complex stated that he had moved to the area with his family 6 months prior and had always felt safe. But now he's afraid to even let his 10-year-old son play outside on his own. Coming back from visiting family for the holiday and seeing police cars surrounding the home was a life-changing experience. We may never really know what exact plan Aziz had for that day. Was he planning to kill his family regardless of what happened, or was he mainly just going to kill them off if they didn't treat him kindly enough? Sadly, there's no way to know, as anyone who could enlighten us on the details is long gone today. It was 2014, just a few months before Christmas. In Coventry, a town in central England, a 34-year-old woman named Samina Imam, a local marketing manager for Costco, was in a bit of trouble. She had a bit of a romantic dispute going on. She was having an affair with a work colleague, a cash-and-carry boss named Roger Cooper, age 41, and had been doing so for 2 years. She herself was not married and presumably only in a relationship with him. He, however, though, was already married. Not only that, but they risked being fired if they were caught having a workplace affair. As one could assume, this kind of relationship was rocky, to say the least, and less than ideal. Since the very beginning of Roger and Samina's relationship, the two had been going back and forth on what to do about his marriage. Samina wasn't too content with being his silver medal for too much longer and started putting on the pressure to end things with his wife. Discussions led to pressure, and pressure led to an ultimatum. Eventually, Samina put her foot down. She told Roger that she wouldn't settle for being an affair partner any longer. Either he would break things off with his wife, or she would walk away. Surprisingly, he went along with the ultimatum and agreed that, by Christmas, everything would change. He promised that the two would spend Christmas together at the Malmaison Hotel in Birmingham. By the time the new year came around, they would be all set to get a fresh start together as an exclusive, no-baggage couple. It was all she wanted for Christmas, so naturally she was overjoyed to hear the news. Those around her said that she was happier than usual, busy preparing for her Christmas trip. But this isn't actually what Roger wanted. Far from it. He was nowhere near ready to end his marriage. Not only that, he felt that if he were to refuse the ultimatum and dump Samina, that she would expose their affair and he would risk losing his job. As relationships were so strictly prohibited, it is very likely, he would probably lose it. Torn between either losing his marriage or losing his job, he was met with the consequences of his actions and he felt cornered. After much internal debate, Roger decided that he wanted Samina out of his life, for good. Enter Roger's younger brother, David Cooper, a 39-year-old ex-Army reservist. The two brothers met up and began to discuss what Roger should do about his predicament. While Samina was planning out her new life, she had no idea that they were planning on ending it. They decided that the best, if not only, solution to the problem would be to take her out. By Christmas, they wanted her dead. Roger and Samina were planning a smaller, more local hotel outing about 2 weeks before the big Birmingham hotel trip. The two brothers decided that this hotel trip would be the ideal time to end her life. On December 12th of 2014, Roger and Samina planned to go to a Christmas party and then, later, at the Solihull Premier Inn, they would spend the night together. He told Samina to meet up at the hotel and that he would catch up later. He said that he had booked a room for her, in which he had planned a surprise. Little did she know he had never booked a hotel room, and the surprise, unsurprisingly, was anything but positive. Roger and David had been plotting their crime in an odd way. They decided that, as code, they would use Star Wars lingo to discuss their plans. Death Star complete. Stay on target. You are expected, Vader. Their plan failed to come to fruition. To to this day it still isn't quite clear why, even to detectives. David waited in the car outside of the hotel, ready to abduct Samina. As the brothers communicated via text in their coded language, Samina arrived at the hotel by taxi and made it inside. Perhaps she was let out too close to the door and David never had the chance to grab her, between the taxi leaving and Samina reaching the door. Either way, David texted his brother in, for some reason, broken French now, saying what basically translated to, "There was no point, no score. The window is closed." The brothers were a bit let down that their plan had failed before it even started, but they weren't really willing to take a loss on this one. They decided to simply start over and come up with a new plan instead, or maybe just do the same thing again. They decided that, 2 weeks later on Christmas Eve, they would strike again, or attempt to strike at least. Roger already had plans to meet Samina at another hotel, after all. That afternoon, the couple left work separately, at different times, in different cars. CCTV footage showed that they both left several minutes apart at around 4 p.m. after getting off work, likely not wanting to be suspected of being in a relationship. A little ways away, once they were both in the clear, they met up once again. Samina unpacked some luggage from her car and loaded it into Roger's Audi. She left her car parked in a safe, quiet road and hopped in with Roger, ready to start their night together. They sped off towards Leicester. This was where David lived. Samina was likely told that this would be a small detour on their way to Birmingham. In the car, Samina spoke with her loved ones for the last time. She texted her sister, asking her how her mom was doing. She told them that, although she couldn't be around for Christmas, she would be there the next day on Boxing Day to celebrate with them. Unfortunately, this would not be the case. They got to David's home in Leicester not long after about 5 p.m. But being winter, it was already pitch black outside. Immediately after entering the home, David attacked Samina, ambushing her. Roger joined in on the attack shortly after. Being that they were two men standing at about 6'5" and 6'7", and she was about 5'2" and fighting 2 against 1, she didn't stand much of a chance. It isn't clear how exactly the ambush went down, but eventually the two brothers smothered her with a chloroform-soaked rag. Roger had bought the chloroform on eBay a few weeks prior in preparation. Bizarrely, the two forced her to drink a concoction full of poison that they had created. This liquid consisted of a combination of several different metallic elements, including antimony, cadmium, tin, arsenic, and even mercury. Needless to say, there was no chance of surviving ingesting such an amalgamation of poisonous elements, especially while unconscious. Samina was dead by 6:25 p.m., but likely much earlier, soon after she entered the home. Minutes later, Roger set off on his journey back home to Coventry. David was left with the task of disposing of the body. Roger had taken Samina's phone with him. In order to cover their tracks, he started texting himself from her phone as soon as he got home. He had planned to give the impression that they weren't in the same place together. Ironically, he did this by implying that they had gotten into an argument, ending her messages with, "I am fuming. I am going to the place where I am truly cared for." Presumably, he thought this would make it seem that she had another lover, a violent one. But all he really did was show that he was the last person to have a conversation with her. A conversation that ended in a fight, nonetheless. At the same time, David was grappling with how exactly to dispose of the body. In less than a few hours, he was burying her on a small, quiet allotment he had owned on Groby Road out in Leicester. He wrapped the body in shrink wrap and put it into an army-issue sleeping bag. He dug a deep hole and buried her far underground where, he hoped, it wouldn't be possible to find her. Ironically enough, David had this sign hanging from a shed near the burial site. For those of you only listening, it says, "Don't wind me up, I'm running out of places to hide the bodies." Whether or not this sign was placed there before or after the murder is unclear, but it is creepy and ironic nonetheless. The two weren't quite done yet. Samina's disappearance was bound to be discovered soon enough. She was all set to meet with her family on Boxing Day, and that obviously wasn't going to happen. They had to plan out how to cover their tracks even more. They took her car, wiped it clean of fingerprints and DNA, and abandoned it 65 miles away in Luton. When she failed to appear at her family dinner, the police were notified and they soon began their search. For a while, there was no trace of her, but on January 4th, her car was discovered. Notably, her handbag was not there, neither was her suitcase or any of the items she had been buying while shopping. The police actually found it more suspicious that there were no fingerprints in the car. It had clearly been wiped down. The driver's seat was notably also pushed back far too much for someone who was only 5'2". Despite there not being a body, this was quickly seen as foul play. It wasn't too hard for detectives to put the pieces together. Information started lining up bit by bit. The data from Samina's phone showed that she had traveled to Leicester. The police learned of her affair with Roger as well. Knowing that he had a brother in that area, they searched David's home. In it, they found a bottle of wine that Samina had bought for Christmas. They found her snacks too, and her navigation system as well. They then received a tip from an anonymous local who told them that they should check the allotment on David's property. Finding disturbed ground, they began to excavate the lot. It was taking some time, but nobody was discouraged. They had a strong gut feeling that this was where they would find the body. And on the 4th day of digging, they did. An edge of a sleeping bag protruded out from beneath the dirt. They uncovered it, removed it, and opened it, revealing Samina inside. Roger and David were arrested 3 days later on the 7th of January on suspicion of murder. 2 days later, they were both charged. Roger cried out loud while being interrogated about Samina's disappearance.
Start with the day that you saw it, the last day you saw it.
It was around 4 p.m, but I haven't got that specific time, so it's around 4 p.m.
Yeah.
And I was leaving, so I gave the regional manager a hug because it's Christmas.
Yeah.
And wished her Happy Christmas. And Sam says, "Where's mine then?" So I went over there and gave her a hug. So I'll talk to you later. And then I left. And within 5 minutes, I'm sure it's within 5 minutes, she phoned.
Okay, she's phoned you. What did you say?
She's saying that, "So I'll see you tonight then." Like, no, I'm not going to be there. She's just trying to persuade me one more time.
They languished in prison for months and months until their trial finally started. It became clear during the trial that they had both spent months planning the murder. Their goofy, coded language was revealed to the court, along with their broken French text messages, and the mountain of other evidence, such as records of them buying chloroform on eBay, which was found in her system, and the CCTV footage of Roger and Samina driving off together on the night of her disappearance. Needless to say, it was a pretty cut-and-dry case. David did, after being charged, admit to the murder. He told police that Samina had passed away on his couch. He said that he poured the chloroform out onto a rag and put it over her face to, quote, shut her up.
This lady, I didn't know her name, she died on my sofa. And it was this woman who I knew to be an associate of my brother's. And she was like, "Where's Roger?" Like, stepping in the house. I was like, "He's not here, he's gone." And she was like, "I haven't seen him leave." And I was like, "Well, I'll call him. He's just left." And she was like walking through the house. And I said, "Look, just sit down and I'll call him," knowing that I wasn't going to call him. Because clearly, in my mind, for my own reasons, I imagined she was looking for him. And I knew that he wanted to go home, and I knew that he didn't want her knowing where he lived. So I was like, gotta let him get away. This sounds really silly, but I was like, okay. So I got her to sit on the sofa. And she was moaning. I don't recall what she was saying, but she was like, "We've made plans. He's supposed to be seeing me." Things like this. And so in my kitchen, I've got an ammo box, a military ammo tin, which I think is normal. And in that, I had a bottle of chloroform. And because seeing it on telly, and I thought it was okay, I thought I'll just shut her up, because my walls are paper thin, I don't want a scene, and I want to give Roger a few minutes. I got the chlorophyll, I poured it over a tea towel, and my kitchen is like 2 steps beneath floor level of the lounge, and My sofa is right next to the doorway, and I just went in and put it across her face, thinking that it would come out. As stupid and naive as it sounds, I did think that it would just buy me some time. And I kind of put it on her face, sat on her lap, and her arms went up, and I grabbed her arms and I forced them down, and I was like, just a couple of breaths. And she didn't wake up, so...
It was felt that he was doing all that he could to absolve his brother of any guilt. A great brother, but a horrible person. It became clear that they had killed a woman merely because she was inconvenient to them. It was easier for them to end a life than to own up to Roger's mistakes. The text messages sent from Samina's phone to Roger didn't fool the courts one bit. We've all seen crime dramas. We know this is standard issue stuff by now. Roger hadn't even taken into account that Samina's phone could be tracked, and the tracking led directly back to his own home at the time when Samina was apparently not supposed to be with him, texting him from afar. It was determined that Roger simply couldn't let his wife learn of his affair, and he couldn't lose his job either. That was seen as more than enough motivation to commit the crime. What is a mystery, though, is why his brother agreed to help him kill a woman that he didn't even know, just to cover up his mistakes. Interestingly, the court learned that the affair with Samina Imam hadn't been the only affair that Roger had been having at the time. He was also in a relationship with another co-worker. This was something that, presumably, Samina had not known of. With this other affair partner, Roger had revealed a much darker side of his character. He had told her to never cross him, and that he was a dangerous person when backed into a corner. And that's exactly what Samina did with her ultimatum. The trial continued for 10 weeks, throughout which there was very little doubt about the brothers' guilt, although they adamantly denied any fault. The judge told the brothers, "The use of a poison in a case such as this demonstrates a cold-blooded intention to kill, regardless of the consequences. The autopsy had shown that the chloroform was the actual cause of death, but the high levels of other metals in her body definitely did not help matters."
It's an extremely unusual way to kill somebody. It's something that you see on television or in fiction. It's a very rare cause of murder or death in real life. And it would have been a real mystery to us how Samina had died if David Cooper hadn't, in fact, confessed to the fact that he'd exposed her to chloroform in his post-charge confessions.
In October, the two brothers were found guilty unanimously by the jury. They were both given a low 30 years each. By the next Christmas, they were both rotting away in prison. This story focuses on a band of teenagers who were known for seeking out trouble. They were a dirt-broke group of kids who had become estranged from their families. They had begun calling themselves the Downtown Posse. They spent most of their days bumming for money at the courthouse square downtown. The leader of the group was a huge, intimidating 19-year-old man named Marvalis Keene. However, despite his demeanor, he had actually never been arrested and was known to be a good student. Until his older brother was killed during a robbery in 1991, that is. This affected him deeply, changing who he was as a person. He became depressed, gave up on school, and took on a dark change in his personality. The second in command, the effectively intellectual leader of the group, was his 16-year-old girlfriend, Laura Taylor. Taylor was known for being extremely tough, often hard on the others. But little did they know what she truly was capable of. Also present in the group was DeMarcus Smith, who was 17, and his girlfriend Heather Matthews, who was 20. The group had collectively grown a little bit bored of bumming for cash and had decided to aim for something bigger. Something much bigger. It was the morning of Christmas Eve in 1992, not the usual time for dark dealings. But despite this, Laura Taylor wasn't feeling so cheerful. Her boredom was getting to her. She began to hassle the other members of the group, pressuring them into doing something heinous. "Let's get some drama in our lives," she told them. Starting off pretty big, they decided to plan a robbery. It wasn't long before they decided on a victim, 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson, an acquaintance of Taylor's. They were going to trick him into inviting Taylor and Matthews into his home by promising he would get to have a fun, naked time with the two girls. They went to his home and were let inside. The two girls pretended to undress in order to get Wilkerson to let his guard down. Shortly after, they pulled a gun and pointed it at him, ordering him to lie on the bed where they tied him up. Bound to the headboard by electrical cords, the two girls, along with Keene, began searching the house for valuables and ransacking it. In the garage, Keene found a .32 caliber Derringer pistol. He, likely desiring to eliminate the witness, returned to the bedroom with the pistol and shot Wilkerson in the chest. Taylor then took the gun from him, put the gun to Wilkerson's head herself, and pulled the trigger. The amount of treasure they got from ransacking the entire house didn't really amount to much. They took a microwave, a small cheap TV, a phone, a curling iron, and a blow dryer. The only thing they ended up taking of much value was Wilkerson's car, and with it, they would take to the town and hunt for more victims. Not only did this vehicle become a great asset for them, but they would continue using Wilkerson's house as a sort of base of operations. They would party in his house for the next several days as he lay dead in his bed, covered by nothing but a pile of clothes and junk. Heading out, they ended up on 517 Neal Avenue. They spotted a woman talking on a payphone, 18-year-old Donita Gillette. Little did she know she was about to become their second victim. Noticing that she had a nice coat and a good pair of shoes, she became an easy target for a quick robbery. Keene came up to the phone booth and said, "Merry Christmas, bitch," pointing a gun at the glass. As she begged for her life, Keene fired a volley of 9 bullets into the booth. She was a senior at Patterson Cooperative High School, the mother of a 2-year-old. This young mother was killed for a pair of tennis shoes, a coat, and a backpack that contained a bounty of exactly 50 cents. Her body was found later by the police, lying on the ground outside the telephone booth, having been shot by 5 of the 9 bullets that were fired. The pavement was covered with blood and shell casings, the latter of which would prove very significant in the long run. The group would later return together to an apartment that Keene owned, one that they would often all stay at, an apartment at 157 Yuma Place. They all planned to crash there for the night, but not before they attempted to take yet another victim, Heather Matthews' ex-boyfriend, Jeffrey Wright. Jeffrey was also there at the apartment, hanging out with the rest of the group that night. After a confrontation, Smith ended up firing off 4 shots into his legs. Strangely though, he survived the attack. He ended up escaping, running off to a neighbor's house, which is nothing short of a miracle when you have 4 bullets in your legs. That night, 2 other friends were at the apartment. Wendy Cottrill, age 16, and Marvin Washington, age 18. They witnessed the attack on Jeffrey. Keene, Taylor, Smith, and Matthews began questioning if the other 2 could keep quiet about the whole ordeal. They began worrying that they would implicate them in not only this attack, but also the other 2 murders they had committed. However, they decided to sleep on it. For now. The next morning, on Christmas Day, the gang started plotting their next robbery. They decided that the next target would be Richard Maddox, age 19, who was Taylor's ex-boyfriend. She convinced him to go to a hotel with her where, unbeknownst to him, the whole group would ambush him and rob him. Maddox left his parents' home and went to pick up Taylor, where they both left together in his car. Keene, Smith, and Matthews followed them from behind in their own vehicle. However, things quickly went wrong. They weren't very good at hiding the fact that they were following Maddox's car. He quickly caught on and slammed his foot onto the accelerator to escape. Taylor, in a rage-fueled panic, pulled a gun and put it to his right temple. She fired, killing him while he was still driving. Quickly realizing the implications of this, she successfully bailed out from the car while it was still moving. The car went on to crash on Benton Avenue. His body was found, and it was clear that he had died from a gunshot while still operating the vehicle. The 4 then spent Christmas night lurking around an ATM on Salem Avenue. They were hoping to kill and rob the next person to use it, but thankfully that just never happened. They all pulled over into a parking lot and parked. They decided that they could get some rest in Wilkerson's car. Despite one of their victims escaping, their suspicions of their friends, and their failed robbery, the group slept the night away, ready for the next big day. The next morning came. It was now the 26th. The gang went over to a gas station and spotted a woman airing up the tires on her Dodge Shadow. They decided it would be nice to have another stolen car on them and ordered her to hand it over at gunpoint. The woman easily could have become their next victim, but she ran away instead of freezing in place as they demanded. She later reported the car stolen. The gang would end up switching the license plates between the vehicles in an attempt to confuse and throw off the police. They all ended up at a short-stop mini-market on West 5th Street, a small family-owned grocery store. Taylor walked inside alone, scoping out the place as a potential new robbery spot. Behind the counter was Sarah Abraham, a young mother of 3. She had just received a hand-drawn picture from her daughter for Christmas just that morning before having to head into work. Keene and Smith came strolling in when Keene abruptly shot Abraham twice in the head, leaving behind identical shell casings to those found outside the phone booth earlier on. They turned around and shot a customer named Jones Pettis. They fired more shots at another customer, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson, and missed. Thompson was able to escape death and injury by pretending to have been hit and falling to the floor. Ironically, just before, he had given the, quote, innocent-looking Laura Taylor a nickel to help her buy a drink when she was short on change. Jones Pettis luckily survived his injuries that day, but Sarah Abraham wasn't near as lucky. She was in the hospital for 5 days, but ultimately passed away there. The gang ended up with a whopping $44 profit from this venture. After the robbery at the grocery store, the group remembered their doubts from the previous night about Cottrell and Washington. They ended up asking the two to hang out, bringing some beer and wine. They drove around for a while until Keene said that he needed to pee. They pulled off into a gravel yard on Richley Drive. The two new victims quickly realized something was up when Keene and Smith ordered them out of the car. In shock, Cottrell didn't move, so Keene ripped her out of the car by her hair. The two were ordered to walk over behind a large pile of dirt. They frantically promised that they hadn't snitched, but it didn't matter. Their fate was sealed. While Cottrell was pleading for her life, Keene put his gun into her mouth and fired. At the same time, Smith executed Washington at close range. The two former friends became the 5th and 6th victims of the spree. They took some gold chains along with Cottrell's shoes before dumping the bodies elsewhere. A short time later on Cumberland Avenue, about 72 hours after the first killing took place, a Dayton police sergeant named John Huber ended up spotting a vehicle that seemed suspicious to him, the Dodge Shadow that had been stolen earlier. He called in a check on the plates, and it came back that those plates weren't even registered to that car. His suspicions validated, he had units close in on the car from all sides. He pulled over the thieves, thinking he was only arresting someone for Grand Theft Auto, but soon found all of the guns in the vehicle. After all of the previous violent fanfare, the actual arrest and capture was pretty uneventful. In the beginning, Taylor ordered Keene to shoot at the police, but he chose not to and gave up peacefully. In turn, so did Taylor and Matthews. They all cooperated, raising their hands as they were told. Smith, on the other hand, decided to take off on foot to a nearby house, but was soon captured. Police were completely unaware that they had just ended one of the worst crime sprees in Dayton's entire history. At the time, police still hadn't found a link between all of the murders occurring in the city, but they definitely stood out as something unusual. The city regularly had fewer than one murder a week, but now they saw 3, that they knew of, occur within the span of just a few days, at Christmas of all times. The first thing that connected the crimes was the identical shell casings found at 2 of the sites. Happening twice in 2 days, the police naturally began to fear that whoever was doing this was going to keep doing it. However, given the random nature of the crimes and the killer being unconnected to the victims, it was proving very difficult to put together. During interrogations, Taylor was described as the most hardened person the police had ever seen, despite being only 16 years old. She was extremely cold and remorseless. She even urinated in her interview room chair instead of asking to use the bathroom, presumably just to spite them. The others more or less cooperated. Eventually, after everyone was interviewed, the police were able to put the puzzle pieces together and figure out what really happened over the previous days. Joseph Wilkerson was found at his home that evening. The 4 members of the gang were put behind bars. That night, Taylor got a visit from a local minister. He had been concerned that someone so young could commit such horrible crimes. He only wished to talk to her. During their conversation, she plainly told him about 2 other victims that the police hadn't found. The 2 supposed traitors, Washington and Cottrell. The next day, on the 27th, the police received an anonymous tip, fairly likely from the minister, that led them to find the bodies of the 2 at the city-owned gravel dump. They were just killing people randomly for nothing. Literally nothing. There was not even a motive in these cases. It was just for fun, said Doyle Burke, who had been a homicide detective that worked on the case. Once they tasted blood, they just couldn't stop, said Dayton Police Sergeant George Hammond. They were all charged with a slew of felonies, including capital murder, of course. Their trials began. As they were considered juveniles under the law, both Taylor and Smith were immune to the death penalty. Matthews ended up taking a deal with the police if prosecutors would agree not to seek execution against her. After Keene was arrested, he sent a letter expressing his remorse to a church that he had attended when he was younger, and his defense attorneys argued that a large factor in the crimes was a form of PTSD that he had suffered when his brother was killed. Keene was not spared with any lenience, however, and was given the death sentence for his crimes. The judges concluded that his level of PTSD absolutely did not outweigh the weight of his misdeeds. Keene was convicted in 5 of the killings. After 17 years' worth of repeated appeals, he was executed by lethal injection on July 21st in 2009 at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He refused to give any last words. Journalists took photos of the spectacle from the outside. Almost 30 years later, the entire group is still in prison, aside from Keene. They're now in their 40s, and parole seems very unlikely. Taylor and Matthews are still serving life sentences for murder at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. Smith is serving out his life sentence at the Mansfield Correction Institute. Heather Matthews blames her role in the killings mostly on peer pressure. She was present during the killings, but never actually fired a weapon herself.
I wanted to be like them. I wanted to do what they was doing.
DeMarcus Smith was responsible for firing shots during 2 of the murders, while Laura Taylor was responsible for pulling the trigger during 3 of the 6 murders. 2 books were written about the case by 2 of the officers who worked in connection to it. They were both released in the late 2000s. The crime remains as a dark, putrid spot on Dayton, Ohio's history to this day. It's unlikely that it'll be forgotten anytime soon, especially given that 3 of the 4 killers are still alive, albeit behind bars. At least we know one of them won't be hurting anyone anymore. Our Christmas villain here is a man named Darrell E. Brooks, a 38-year-old man from Milwaukee. Those who have interviewed him recently have described him as a man who seems to be soft-spoken, calm, and even lucid. The comment on lucidity will seem more relevant in a bit. Brooks' mother has said that her son suffered from quite a storm of mental illness ever since he was a little kid. All throughout his childhood, he was treated with a strict regimen of medication and therapy. But once he embarked into adulthood, he lost the insurance that had been paying for all of that medication and therapy. After that, he spiraled out into a cycle of jail and crime-ridden freedom. Brooks was somewhat known online as an amateur rapper by the stage name Math Boy Fly. He frequently acknowledged his frequent run-ins with the police, even going so far as writing in the description of some of his music that, after multiple legal battles, he started turning the life he lived in the streets into music. He wasn't exactly lying, though. He had a fat list of legal battles under his belt. There are almost too many charges against him. I mean, it would take up a huge chunk of this video, but just for the sake of comprehension, let's go over them briefly. 1999, aggravated battery, carrying a concealed weapon. 2000, carrying a concealed weapon, loitering, resisting or obstructing an officer, possession of cocaine. 2002, resisting or obstructing an officer, driving a vehicle without consent, possessing THC. 2003, resisting or obstructing an officer. 2005, resisting or obstructing an officer, receiving stolen property, possession of a controlled substance. 2009, paternity warrant issued, resisting or obstructing an officer. 2010, strangulation and suffocation, domestic abuse battery, criminal damage to property. 2011, probation violation, failure to appear in court, paternity warrant, possession of THC, possession with intent to sell, bail jumping. 2012, bail jumping, failure to appear in court, resisting an officer, possession of THC. 2020, possession of a firearm as a felon, endangering safety, reckless use of a firearm, possession of meth. 2021, paternity warrant served, domestic battery, bail jumping, endangering safety, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. The man was charged for bail jumping after multiple incidents, firing off guns during arguments, obtaining stolen guns, getting caught with funny, multicolored pills that just happened to test positive for methamphetamines, and more. While a lot of rappers really play up their crimes for show, he didn't. Now let's bring the story up to November of 2021, leading to a popular yearly Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Heading up to this parade, Brooks was out making some mischief yet again. He was accused of both DV and of using his vehicle as a weapon. A 31-year-old woman that he had made a child with accused him of coming to her motel, yelling at her, taking her phone, and speeding off. She walked over towards a gas station when Brooks pulled up to her, telling her to get into the car. She refused, which didn't go over too well. Brooks responded by punching her in the face. Then, while she staggered away, he ran over her with the vehicle. She was left with blood all over her face, a swollen lip, and tire tracks all over her left leg. Police were called and went over to Brooks's home, where they caught him getting out of a red Ford Escape. He ignored the police when they ordered him to stop and ran into his home instead. He was arrested soon anyway. Brooks was soon booked and sent to Milwaukee County Jail on November 3rd. Unfortunately, just a couple of weeks later, he was released on November 16th. All he had to do was pay a $1,000 bail and he was ready to go. It was now 5 days before the parade. John Chisholm would later go on to say that the dollar amount on the bail was, quote, inappropriately low in the light of the nature of his recent charges and the pending charges against Mr. Brooks, which included many of his more recent charges on the previous list. This was also egregious that it would later require an official internal review. And now the fateful day of the Christmas parade. Just a couple of hours before the parade, Brooks was out, again, up to his usual shenanigans. That Sunday, Brooks was in Waukesha, fleeing the scene of an altercation in which he brandished a knife. Once police were called and arrived on the scene, Brooks hopped into a red SUV and bolted from the scene, a bit of foreshadowing of what was to come. Police weren't able to respond to this scene for very long. A little while after 4:30 p.m., the parade in Waukesha was already in progress. People were enjoying themselves with marching, bands, floats, dancing, and singing all over. Hundreds of people were participating in the parade, and thousands more were spectating. A Waukesha police detective, Tom Casey, was conducting traffic control for the parade. A while into the parade, he started hearing a horn honking. Looking over, he saw a crowd of people parting as they jumped away from a quickly oncoming, you guessed it, red Ford Escape. At this point, the Escape wasn't exactly moving dangerously fast yet. It was still slow enough that Casey was able to yell at the driver and pound on the hood several times, ordering him to stop the car and get the hell out of the parade route. A witness recorded as he saw the SUV barrel straight through several police barricades blocking off the parade route. Another officer ended up experiencing something very similar just a moment later, as the SUV was now going about 25 miles per hour. It was around 4:38 p.m. when the officer put himself in front of the car, held up his hand, and yelled for it to stop a multitude of times. But again, the driver did not listen. He kept on going. There was little that the on-foot officer could do as the vehicle continued to plunge its way in through the parade route. At first, the officer just thought that the driver was a moron who ended up in the parade by mistake and was trying to find his way out. However, this was not the case. He soon discovered when the driver peeled out into full speed and abruptly swerved straight into the crowd. A video captured by a parade viewer shows a young girl dancing in the street when the vehicle sped past her at a dangerous speed, only missing her by a few feet at the most. Further down, the city was live streaming the parade when, suddenly, the marching band in the middle of playing Jingle Bells was quickly interrupted by a red SUV barreling straight into their path from behind. Spectators yelled out in terror. The crowd screamed and fled backwards as the car struck down a number of members of the marching band. It hit at least 2 people initially and continued to roll over them. The car kept going down the road into People's Park, where it kept going and didn't stop. At this point, a police officer opened fire in a desperate attempt to stop the driver. The car continued regardless, moving in a zigzag pattern in order to avoid vehicles, but not people. It clearly was aiming for the people, and it hit many. A total of 6 people were killed in the incident, ages ranging from 8 to 81 years old. 4 of the 5 people who were killed were part of a dance group called the Milwaukee Dancing Grannies. The victims were Virginia Sorensen, 79, Leanna Owen, 71, Tamara Durand, 52, Jane Coolidge, 52, and Wilhelm Hospill, age 81, along with an 8-year-old boy. Many more were injured. First responders and even residents of the town quickly rushed over to the scene in order to try to keep the victims alive and stable as possible. Some civilians even rushed the victims to the hospital in their own personal vehicles. By that night, a local hospital in Waukesha County was treating 13 victims from the incident. 3 were listed as being in critical condition, 4 were in serious condition, and 6 were seen as being in fair condition. Froedtert Hospital in Milwaukee, which was the only Level 1 trauma center in all of southeast Wisconsin, was treating an unspecified number of victims from the massacre themselves. Given that that level of trauma center usually only cares for critically ill patients, it's easy to see the level of severity of what they were dealing with. At least 18 of the hospitalized victims were children from the age of 3 to 16. Many of them were hospitalized at Children's Wisconsin. Luckily, many of them were only there for injuries ranging from facial lacerations to broken bones or bruises. Some, however, did have serious head injuries. These kids included 3 sets of siblings who ended up getting injured together. Brooks had managed to escape the scene during the chaos, but not for long. He showed up at a nearby house, banging on the door and desperately asking the owner of the home to call an Uber for him.
Hey, I called an Uber, and I'm supposed to be waiting for it over here, but I don't know when it's coming. Can you call it for me, please? My ID.
Police showed up, arresting him soon after. He was then taken into custody. Flags were flown at half-mast the next day all over Wisconsin and the U.S. as a whole as the people of Waukesha continued to mourn what had happened to their community. Many people were left dead and many more were traumatized for life, mourning loved ones. Class was canceled all throughout the city, as well for the kids. Mourners were on site attending a candlelight vigil to mourn the victims in Cutler Park, despite it only being a day after the incident. Hundreds of people were there to mourn victims and to support the survivors. Brooks was the only suspect. He had clearly acted alone. He faced 5 accounts of intentional first-degree homicide along with a myriad of other additional cases in relation to the incident. As he languished away in jail, his mugshot and his story were blasted all over televisions all throughout the United States and in some other countries as well. His lengthy criminal record and his, in itself, criminally low bail were the main talking points, aside from the massacre. At this point, officers hadn't really come up with much of a motive for the incident. Something that came to be of note was that all of the victims who died in the incident were white. But when looking at the demographics for the city, Hispanic and non-Hispanic white people make up roughly 89% of the population, so the odds are pretty high that you'd encounter much more white people when attacking at random. So, does this mean anything? Well, it's hard to say on its own. It's safe to imagine that it would be fairly hard to pick out specific targets when driving through a crowd, but once people started going through his tweets and Facebook posts, people began to wonder if this was all racially motivated after all. Immediately when hearing the lyrics, you're hit with such gems as "fuck the pigs" and "fuck Donald Trump." Not really too out of the ordinary at this point. I mean, it's rap, hating cops is pretty commonplace. Hating Donald Trump isn't really anything out of the ordinary either, but things get darker and more weird. When pressing onto his social media, you're met with various posts that are a lot more alarming. Brooks shared posts that outright called for violence against white people. Seemingly contradictory, he also shared posts stating that a certain reviled German leader was right for killing Jews. This is a notably common belief of a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites, a cult that believes that the true Israelites of the Bible were ethnically black. A less common but still prevalent belief of the group is that the Jews were killed because that certain leader knew that the true Hebrews were not them but an ethnically black group, and that America has moved the fake white Jews into the state of Israel to perpetuate this lie. This has been thoroughly debunked across the board, but that often isn't a factor when it comes to beliefs such as these. Many of his tweets, Facebook posts, and memes have since been deleted, but a lot of them remain online in screenshots in which we are to see his demented, uninformed, kinda dumb thought process. Brooks made his initial court appearance the very next day, on Tuesday. He cried all throughout the proceedings, stooped forward with his head almost completely in his lap. His court-appointed attorney patted him on the back in an attempt to soothe him, likely in order to get him to quiet down. "I just feel like I'm being made out to be a monster, demonized and dehumanized," he would go on to say. I wonder why, what the fuck? Brooks is now being held on a $5 million bond, a substantial increase from his previous pathetic bond. The State Public Defender's Office continues to refuse comment on the situation. As this case is very recent and still very relevant, little details here and there are bound to emerge or even change in the oncoming weeks. So stick with the channel and I'll give you periodic updates from time to time. And Merry Christmas. Thank you again for watching this video, and hopefully all of the Christmas videos this month. I had intended to wear a Christmas hat, but I don't know where it is. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, it always helps. If you disliked it, it doesn't matter anymore. Be sure to subscribe if you like content like this. It's pretty much 90% of what I talk about, maybe more. And if you really want to support the channel even further, I do have a Patreon, which I link in the description below. And speaking of which, shout out to my top patrons: Jewel G, Wafrans, Callahan, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Alan Damiani, Adrian Lawley, Winnicott, Murray Joel Sanchez, David McLaughlin, Marsh, Buffa Zerk, Lonro, Jewel Mav Chan, Lori Tayaba, Kim Peak, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Skooky Main, Foxlicity, Jackie, and Tracer Ferguson. As usual, you guys are not bad, but quite the opposite, pretty good. And Merry Christmas. Again, I just said that, but it's still true 2 minutes later.